Okay, so let's go ahead and finish off this part of the West. And what act would give two corporations massive amounts of free money, no interest loans, and massive amounts of land to sell? Yeah. And sometimes you might see that's the Pacific Railroad Act. You might see it as that. They're called both. What were the two railroads? What was the railroad that went this way? Who was the president? Yeah, Leland Stanford. Yeah. Weird dude. Yeah. What railroad went this way? Yeah. And there are other transcontinentals. And I would mention mining. Oh, so when the United States made a decision that they were going to totally conquer the plains, there was a three-pronged strategy: divide and conquer. Was the first part? What's the other one then? Send tribes to what? Yeah, to reservations. And what's the third?
Total war.
Yeah, it was total war. And don't forget, the very same people who prosecuted the Civil War at the end, Sheridan, Sherman, and the President, Grant, they're now responsible for that, and they took that same tactic. It was very clear: to starve people to death. Did we show you this picture right when the bell rang? I didn't show you this? Well, did I mention where all the buffalo hides went to? The bison hides. Yeah, belts for factories. But you cannot find any bones on the plains, because then they went and they gathered them up. This was obviously for dramatic purposes, but those are buffalo skulls. And they would be gathered near railroad heads, railheads. That's where they left. So wherever this was the Santa Fe or the Frisco or the Missouri Pacific when they went across here. The furthest western spot was called the railhead. And they gathered them up and shipped them east. And what were bones used for? Ground up for fertilizer. You can still buy bone meal fertilizer today. You go to the garden shop. Yeah. You have nitrogen based, but also bone, because there's nitrogen in bone. And that's why you just can't find any buffalo bone. Yeah.
I have a question back to the total war kind of thing. So I understand that they were kind of fighting for equal rights for the Civil War. Was that just for white people and black people, not including any other races? Because
even Reconstruction, yeah, it was only for former slaves. And that was abandoned, not for American Indians, not at all. They weren't considered citizens.
And was there a reason why they didn't consider them? Or why, I guess?
It's complex, partially, most certainly racism. But the other part was it's still considered they were separate entities in these tribes. And that's why they would have treaties with American Indian tribes and then we get a reservation, so that's why.
Okay.
And then eventually the United States can decide, no, the best way to handle this is to destroy the tribes. Not just force them into reservations and starve them, literally destroy the tribes. And so that's yeah, in the last really big buffalo hunt right here, in 1 3-year period, hunters killed 6 million buffalo. 6 million, 1 3-year period. Just under, which is hard even to wrap your mind around. So at that, Sand Creek, 1864, was the first one of these where buffalo hunters were going out onto the plains of Colorado. And the reason we're doing this one is obviously I'm not going to cover every battle, but just a few. But this would be prototypical. Massive bison herds here before they got split by the railroad. And it's 1864, during the war. So you can imagine a city that literally just boomed because of mining. Denver, they're going to have a big militia because of fear of Confederate attack. I know it seems kind of weird, but there are Confederates here, and many of these tribes here who were forced West and Indian removal joined the Confederacy because they hated the United States so much. And so they had a big militia. Well, buffalo hunters were being harassed by Cheyenne. And so in the winter of 1864, remember I told you the winter campaigning because that's when American Indian tribes would hunker down for the winter. In the summer, they moved so quickly, they could, much faster than the cavalry could. Much faster. And infantry, foot soldiers, no way they could catch up. I should add, because of that, if the U.S. Army ever did try to force tribes onto the reservation in the summer, if they saw any American Indian tribes, they attacked. Because the thought was they'll run away if we don't. Which is kind of mind-boggling. Most of these are winter campaigns. So militia with some regular forces, but pretty well equipped because of the war, under a colonel by the name of Robert Shivington. Shivington was the he was a local businessman, did a little training, but like most of the soldiers, did minor training. And they're all geared up to go fight and find these Cheyenne. But during the winter when they went out, this miserable winter, cold on these plains, they couldn't find them until they found a camp that we always call Black Kettle's camp, but American Indians have much more complex leadership than that. And the United States always looked for a male to be in charge when it was much more complex. But we're going to call that Black Kettle. They were not harassing, not only were they not harassing American or harassing buffalo hunters, they were flying an American flag to show they weren't. But Shivington thought, well, one's as good as another. And they ordered a surprise attack in the morning against a peaceful camp that had no idea what hell was coming on them. And that became the norm. Morning, like literally sun up or just before the sun came up, surprise attacks in the winter. So these are going to happen all over Montana in 1876, 1877. Surprise night attacks, or just morning. And the orders were, basically, the first order was take no prisoners, kill everybody. And Shivington was asked, what about children? And Shivington's response would become very famous. Nits make lice. You know what a nit is? It's the egg in the water, getting the hair. So kill the kids because they're going to become lice. And so they went after and tried to kill everybody. Now, the only thing that would save half of Black Kettle's encampment is because the soldiers were so disorganized and many of them were drunk that many, including Black Kettle, were able to hide. But of the 400 or so people who lived there, remember, these nomadic tribes have to be small by definition. Half will be killed. And most are children or early on. And this would become the norm. And like I said, a bunch in Montana, especially eastern Montana, because that's where the buffalo hunting grounds were. And what's going to happen to Shivington when word of this massacre hit? He got a medal. This was seen as a great victory. And this would become the template for future battles. Black Kettle would eventually be killed when his peaceful encampment flying an American flag would be attacked by U.S. cavalry in what is now Oklahoma. By cavalry under the command of a Civil War hero by the name of George Custer, a place called Washita. We're not going to talk about that one in here. Like I said, there's a lot of things to cover. But we've got to cover Black Kettle, because this would set the template. So think about when it happened, and then you got miners in Montana, and that's going to lead to up here. You have all these mines, and the miners need food, not only going through the land, but also bison. Well, a trail would be laid out from the Oregon Trail named after the person who founded it or forged it. His name was John Bozeman. I have no idea what city is going to be named after John Bozeman, but it went to the mining camps. And that went to the prime Lakota and Cheyenne hunting ground. And so this is going to trigger a war to try to cut off this trail after the Civil War. And we dubbed this just kind of generically Red Cloud War along the Bozeman Trail. And Lakota, but also Cheyenne, and the many various groups of the Cheyenne. This is Red Cloud right here. And he had been fighting for a very long time. His favorite people to fight were to go on raiding missions against Crows, but that's another story. And this was a really bloody fight along the 3 forts that the U.S. Army made along this trail. And one's in Montana, 2 in Wyoming. And like Phil Kearny was a Civil War hero, so was Reno. But Kearny died at the Second World War. If you go there, they're pretty well maintained. Fort Kearny is really well maintained. You really get an idea how desperately difficult this was to be a fight, and the Lakota won. Their raids were so devastating, and they, for the most part, tried to avoid major fights like this is called the wagon box fight. The cavalry hid behind wagons. Set piece battles like that, the Lakota did not win. But the raiding part did really well, and they actually cut off the trail. I would recommend going there. It's really neat along the Bighorn Mountains. The Bighorn Mountains are really pretty mountains anyways. And I remember going there when it was my story. It's story time. Me as a youth. I went down there when I must have been 12 or 13. And I know what you're thinking. We didn't have cars then. Yes, we did have cars. Yeah. I wasn't in a wagon and buggy. But we were driving along the highway there. It was in Wyoming, and it was summer. It was a really hot day. It was August. There were so many grasshoppers on the road that you couldn't see the pavement. There were so many, because it was relatively early in the morning. They all came out to sun themselves early in the morning. And literally, there were so many grasshoppers. You would go, and it'd be just covered with grasshoppers. Which, there's so many more back than today, it seems like. Just covered with them. In fact, we drive over them, and it sounded like popcorn. And it wasn't that running over them. It was you drive over them, and they would all hop up and hit the bottom of the car. And there were cars that slid off the road because their wheels started sliding in all the grasshopper guts. So you should go in August. That one has stuck in my head. I mean, just grab, like one of those where you take a step and 1,000 grasshoppers would pop in your mouth, hop all over you. Oh. It was a plague of locusts. Okay, so with that, so the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868 was a Lakota victory, but the United States tricked them because of, they couldn't really understand the legalese in the treaty. And the Lakota agreed to go on reservations to be cared for by the United States for the rest of their life. Basically saying, we'll go onto the reservation, and we're going to give you this land, a lot of this land, but then you'll pay it back by providing us food forever. And they didn't realize what they had signed away. And Red Cloud would not be much into the next war because he was already pretty old by then. But this is the Great Sioux Reservation in South Dakota. So basically the entire western part of South Dakota. And technically the Black Hills, which was a very important spot for Plains Indians. If you need tall lodgepole pines or teepees or travois to pull behind horses, areas where there's lots of lodgepole pines, incredibly important, the Black Hills. They would come, Kiowa and Comanche would come all the way from Texas up to here to get those poles. Has anyone been to the Black Hills? Like, did you drive to it and you see it? It's pretty amazing because you have this black hump out there in the plain because of the forest. You get closer and closer. It's really cool, but a few tourists. Did you go to Mount Rushmore? Trout Haven? All the little tourist traps there. Field trip to in Custers, South Dakota, there's Flintstone Village where they have big models of Flintstone characters. It's really cool, no? So all this area was Indian land forever, but they could go in the summer and hunt buffalo, hunt bison, and then come back to the reservation. A lot stayed there all year, and they were non-treaty Indians, they were called. And this is going to directly lead to the biggest of the wars in the Great Plains that directly affected Montana. The United States would call this the Great Sioux War. And what happened was, in 1874, gold was discovered in Black Hills. Now, this is treaty land to the Lakota and Cheyenne, too. But that would trigger a gold rush. And a lot of Lakota and Cheyenne said, well, the hell with it. They lied through their teeth. We're going to go to this unceded land, and we're going to hunt buffalo, hunt bison right here, even though the numbers were dramatically dropping already by then. This is what considered to be one of the last great buffalo hunts. And ironically, or maybe not, yeah, it is kind of ironic. It was a military operation that found the gold under a lieutenant colonel, used to be a general in the war, but they reduced the size of the army by the name of George Custer. He's kind of everywhere. He's one of the most famous soldiers on the plains. And let's be very clear about it. There's some things that are I would argue, pretty horrible about him and things that aren't. It's a complex element of history. Well, they all went out to here, these massive groups, eventually about 10,000 to well over half of the population of the Great Sioux Reservation. And this is going to end the peace strategy of Grant, where the decision was we're going to have this massive U.S. Army operation to run them back into the reservation and force them to stay forever. So basically, the United States is going to violate the treaty, which, by the way, the U.S. did not force the people who came in the gold rush out. Have you heard of Deadwood or Lead, South Dakota? Those were part of the gold rush. And so, a massive operation to force them to totally capitulate, surrender. And so, a big U.S. force from Missoula, from Bismarck, North Dakota, then it was Fort Abraham Lincoln, and up from Fort Fetterman, which is down here in Utah, or in Wyoming. And the idea was to hem them in. And the thought was either force them back in just by saying, look at the sheer numbers, or if three groups, we can push them in where they can't run away. Because the thought was in the summer, they'll run away. This is going in the summer of 1876. And they had no idea how many would actually be gathered up. Remember, most of these groups in the plains are going to be pretty small because of food. But eventually, there might be as many as 4,000 or 5,000 in one group right here. And as it moved here, this column, under a general by the name of Terry, sent the cavalry, which is kind of reconnaissance, under the second in command of the 7th Cavalry, George Custer. The command was a guy named Sturgis. He was back in the east. And yes, Sturgis, South Dakota, you heard that was named after him. They sent, as the main column went down the Yellowstone, there's Custer trying to hem them in, and he found the encampment. And even though it's bigger than they could imagine, the thought was they'll run away if we don't attack, and so they attacked. He broke it. It was actually a really haphazard attack. Actually, his unit we broke up into 4 separate groups, which is kind of crazy. But June 25th, 1876. And this is probably one of the most famous battles of the plains, and it happened in Montana. The historical park is really well done. Has anyone been there? I got a few, yeah. I've been there a few times. It's really good. Last time I went out, a rattlesnake strike at me. I didn't know I could jump so high. Actually, it was probably 10 feet away, but kind of like, there it was. Like, ah! Okay, so there's the 7th Cavalry. It had about 450 men. And Custer's plan, well, he didn't really have a plan, but about the 220 that were with him, they were going to kind of sweep into the main village and take women and children hostage. Why take them hostage? That would force the men, the warriors, to surrender. But they got caught on a group of hills and were slaughtered. Probably the most important of the leaders, even though he was quite old so couldn't fight anymore, was a Humpapa Sioux by the name of Lakota. Sitting Bull. And that's Sitting Bull right here. And he had spent his whole life trying to fight, well, fighting Crows. Boy, did he hate Crow. But also fighting the expansion of the United States. And he was back at the camp that also was assaulted. The most famous of the Lakota Warriors was somebody named Crazy Horse. And I just found a generic picture because we don't know what Crazy Horse looked like. That winter when he finally came in out of the, being run down by the cavalry, came in and not only surrendered, is more complex than that, he refused to have his picture taken. He said, why do you want to steal my shadow like you've stolen everything else? And so he didn't have it taken. And so we don't know what Crazy Horse looks like. If you go, though, to the Black Hills, so Mount Rushmore was made, and it wasn't long afterwards they started it, but then basically nothing happened from the 50s to about the 80s. They decided to make a monument for American Indians, and they decided to make a Crazy Horse one. They had no idea what they looked like, so they came up with, they wanted a man who was Lakota. And it's now pretty close to being finished. Did you go see it when you were there? just south of Mount Rushmore. I know that you see a lot of stuff where you forget, but it's about 20 miles south of Mount Rushmore. It's a crazy one. And Custer's forces were overwhelmed. His 200-some men by probably 1,000 warriors. And that's a picture from one of the, from a Lakota at the Standing Rock Reservation 20 years after the battle, describing the battle. He said it was the last good time we ever had. Whatever. I mean, killing people, but then again, that's what they did. And about half of this force would be killed in along with Custer. And Anheuser-Busch did this whole advertising campaign to sell this new beer they were selling. It's actually a Czech beer, but they Germanized it and called it Budweiser. And at the turn of the century, and they made these posters, and these would appear in bars all over the United States with the statement, Custer's last fight. Or somebody just seen as Custer's last stand. And they still in some old bars. It was just an advertising gimmick, but it really set in people's mind what the fight was like. But they were just overwhelmed. About half survived. And here are some of the bones after the battle they found when they reinterred them. That's what it looks like today. That's Custer's Hill. And they basically tried to put markers where men fell. The big one is where Custer fell, where his body was. But some of the bodies were moved, and so it's not 100% certain. And about 2 days after the battle, Zamboni's back. I want a Zamboni. Now I'm totally distracted. I have a Zamboni, but I need batteries.
No.
What's a Zamboni?
Oh my gosh, you're the Barbie.
Huh?
Why do you the Barbie?
It's Nazi Barbie. I'll show you Nazi Barbie.
Oh my god.
Oh yeah, it's Nazi Barbie. I'll find the Zamboni. Oh, maybe I break things. I should add, I broke my, this is broke. It's barely hanging on. I ordered 2 more mice to break. To use. Zamboni. So this is the Zamboni song? Oh.
Wait, Mr. Is that so at the bottom? Wait, read that for me, the very bottom backwards.
Anheuser-Busch Brewing Association.
Is that where Bush Beer comes from?
Budweiser, Anheuser-Busch, yeah. It's German brewers, yeah. And so it took about 2 days for forces under a general by the name of Terry and Colonel Gibbon, the Civil War hero, to make it down here to the Little Big One. And then they went by steamboat and finally made it back to the nearest telegraph line, which is in present-day Bismarck, North Dakota. And then it got to the East Coast. So the battle's on the 25th. What day did it appear in the newspapers? Do you want to guess what day? Is it? Yeah, July 4th, 1876. Might that be an important one? That's the centennial. 100 years and all these celebrations, just with its humiliating defeat of one of the most well-known U.S. soldiers. And that is going to trigger, by the way, the tribes broke up. They couldn't stay that long. One of the largest military operations in history, the destruction of the Sioux. A massive winter campaign, this is forces under a general by the name of Crook, to go through this entire area and run down and attack the various tribes. There'll be a couple big battles on the Powder River in the winter, miserable winter. I mean, it's cold there. A heck of a lot colder then than now. And so, with that, run them down in winter campaigns. And they built forts all over this area. Some people escaped into Canada, then came back, eventually. And then there's no more treaties. The United States is going to dictate to the survivors that they're going to go to these reservations here. Order them into it. And those became the reservations, and that's how much land the American Indians lost. And some of the land is pretty good, some isn't, it's complex, but I'll get to that. So they lost all of this land, of course, to the Black Hills. And one of the generals within the colonels when they shrunk the army, major, sorry. He was a Civil War hero. He built a fort right here after one of the men who died with Custers right here called Fort Keogh, and his name was Nelson Miles. So there's always going to be a little town next to the forts, and that became Miles Town, Miles City, and that's where I grew up, in the shadow of one of those forts. Fort Keogh today is now an agricultural research center. It's one of those weird, quirky things. So, after they were destroyed in that horrible winter campaign, by the way, Crazy Horse would be captured and then murdered while he was there. Shot or bayoneted to death by a guard. And 1877, the last real thing hit Montana. The Nez Perce who lived here, and they had a treaty to have that land. Well, after the Sioux, the U.S. government said, you're going to a reservation. They refused and fought back. And in a couple clashes with settlers, about 200 Nez Perce, including about 80 fighters, who were some of the best on the plains, they took off running. They heard Sitting Bull went to Canada, so they're going to Canada. There were, like I said, lots of leaders, but the most famous, the one that would be in all the papers, would be Chief Joseph. So that's what we heard of. By the way, you like the Nez Perce hairdo? It always reminds me of like a 1950s pompadour haircut, back here. I was thinking like almost like Elvis. I think it's a pretty cool haircut. That's Chief Joseph. Their plan was to go into Canada. So they went this way, assuming that they would be free once they got into Montana because they're out of Idaho. Well, they beat past an American force here, we forced in here. There's a battle here where they defeated a bigger U.S. force at the Big Hole battlefield. If you want to visit the Big Hole, yeah, you've been to all these places now. It's a pretty. If you want to go to a battlefield and go to see a beautiful area, but also just see what happened, it's really amazing. Huh? Big Hole battlefield. It's a beautiful area. They got the visitor center overlooking this big valley where it all happened. They did a great job preserving that. It's really cool. They even went across the very new Yellowstone National Park, fled up past Billings, and almost made it. So they stopped for one extra night because they were so exhausted. And soldiers, including under Nelson Miles, the Miles City, Miles Town, captured them. And they would all be in prison. Now there weren't that many. They'd be in prison. Chief Joseph would be sent to a prison in the Florida Keys. But the rest would be forced into the reservation. And this story of this, it's in many ways it would become so well known as a tragedy because public opinion. This went in the newspapers, and especially on the East Coast. A lot of people were saying, what are we doing to these people? And they got this idea that they're somehow more noble, but they always added the noble savage part. With the idea being this noble fight for the land, but they're still savages. So there's that element of prejudice there. And there's also an element that really irritated people in the West. Because then you have here saying, why not let them have the land? And then citizens of the United States are going to say, yeah, who lived in Montana, but you guys stole the land too. Why should we not steal the land? And so there's going to be a lot of resentment there. And that kind of thing kind of goes on to today. But, not about land, but that kind of idea. And so the Bureau of Indian Affairs is going to run these reservations, the BIA. And so the person actually in charge of the reservation into the next century was called an Indian agent. And this was a plum government job because it was a place of corruption, or another term is graft. And graft is stealing money from the government. And what they would do is the Indian agents would use their position to get money appropriated from Congress to buy food. And then would they use all that money to buy food? No, they'd overpay for the food and they get money under the table called a kickback. And who would suffer on the reservations? So there's a lot of story about, so I've read a lot about Lakota just because of Montana. So but for many of them, it's the first time they're ever hungry. It was on the reservation, where they're supposed to be cared for, because the food was so substandard or non-existent. And so these reservations became places of absolute misery. And by the 1880s, there were maybe 250,000 American Indians left alive, on reservations at least. And on the reservations, it is just suffering. And the story was there's always, you have more relatives and friends amongst the dead than the living. And this is going to lead to one of the most sad and tragic religions in American history. It's going to happen on the reservations and spread like wildfire through people who are absolutely desperate and just lost hope, just completely lost hope. It's going to be called the Ghost Dance religion. And it really started a year earlier, but with like wildfire in 1889. Like wildfire. There was a private Indian by the name of Wovoka. Here's Wovoka right here. He was raised near a missionary, so he had kind of a combination of private religion, Christian religion, you know, this amalgamation, which a lot of religions are like that. This amalgamation. But basically what's this? If you believed enough, Jesus would come back and get rid of the whites, the buffalo, the bison would come back, and your relatives would come back from the dead. Thus, ghost things. Does that make sense now? Your relatives will come back. Remember I said it's a combination of religions. And since you had the Christian element, now a lot when it got to the Sioux, they kind of forgot that part. But it was, if you do this, if you believe it up, how would they show this? I mean, he started to dance. He showed up by a dance. And soon wearing a ghost dance shirt. Dance and believe they would come back. And there's hardly anybody left on the reservation. These are just miserable. But to a lot of people in the United States, they got really scared. Is this going to be another Great Sioux War? Which was ridiculous because they can't. They're done. There's no way they can fight back. Hardly anybody left. But this is going to become very political. The Republican Party, the GOP, the Republican Party back then, 1889, 1890, they were really worried they would lose both the House and the Senate big time. There's a Republican president by the name of Benjamin Harrison, but he didn't win the popular vote. He barely got elected, beating Uncle Grover, Grover Cleveland. We'll talk about them. And these all just become states. And they thought if we get a war going, we can win elections. We get Republicans elected to these brand new state assemblies and elect Republicans in the Senate. And so they exaggerate the threat of a few thousand desperate people, because everyone knew about the Lakota. And Sitting Bull, who all thought this was kind of silly, but he liked the fact that it scared the white. Pay attention. And Sitting Bull was murdered. He was killed. There was a confrontation in front of his cabin. He was killed, and this set up just a panic. And there's a reservation right here, Standing Rock, and a few hundred people just, oh my God, they're going to kill us all. And they took off walking across in the middle of winter. We're talking temperatures 30 to 40 below zero. You've been to this area in the winter? It's beautiful. You don't know what cold is until you go there. Is that fair? It's unreal. True story. Here's my story time. Driving across South Dakota, going to see my grandparents in Nebraska in the winter. We got snowed in right here because the temperature was 55 degrees below zero, and zero. And the wind was anywhere from 60 to 100 miles an hour. That means the wind chill was 3,000 below zero. Can't make that far there, but it was so cold. So I spent a Christmas in a little hotel in Kadoga, South Dakota one year. I know I'm bragging again, yeah, pretty worldly. So with that, the cavalry was this massive exodus from Standing Rock Reservation, and the cavalry stopped them. the cavalry was sent. Now, when the cavalry got there, they realized, oh my God, this sad crew, a few men with rifles, most of them were women and children or the elderly and children, not really fighters, obviously brave, but terrified people. It's 30 below zero. But in the process of disarming them, a lot of the men said, wait, we need this to hunt because we have no food. Not exactly sure what happened, but this would turn into the Battle of Wounded Knee. Or a better way to look at it is the Massacre of Wounded Knee. The cavalry sent the cavalry. Who was the cavalry? The 7th Cavalry. The very same cavalry unit that Custer was in, and they wanted revenge. Some of the same units were there. And they had some, unlike Custer, they had some rapid-fire artillery, called Hodges guns, but also, have you heard of something called a Gatling gun? They could fire 200 rounds a minute. They jammed a lot. But they just mowed them down and killed at least 200 people. Here are men and women frozen solid. And then they had to use picks and axes to chop through the dirt to dig a mass grave. And this is going to have great meaning to American Indians. Especially the American Indians, this is called the American Indian Movement in the 1970s, trying to fight for more rights on the reservation. And the first really symbolic moves was at Wounded Knee. Yeah.
Why would they dig graves? Because I feel like they would just leave them there. Like, I feel like they.
Well, partially because there were, I mean, the thought was they wanted to act like this was a battle, and so they'd have some respect for people they thought it was in, but it really wasn't a battle. But the second reason they're worried about what happens if it's left all winter, what happens in the spring. You have these decaying bodies that are much more. But we don't know the exact number. It was a slaughter. Wounded Knee is just, and it's an end. That would be the end of the American Indian Wars. So it's a big deal. It's south of it's southeast, right about here. And the U.S. Army, to try to hide what really happened, at this battle, they would give the most Congressional Medals of Honor, which is today the highest award for bravery, the most of any battle, would be at Wounded Knee. To try to hide what happened. You know, say it was a glorious battle and all this bravery. So that is going to lead to the Dawes Act. I'm going to put down the year, but it's 1887. And what the Dawes Act was this was an effort to destroy the tribes. And the thought was, okay, now that we got reservations, how do we civilize them? And so the thought was we blow up the tribes. So they tell families or individuals to give up their tribal membership, and they'll get a homestead, 160 acres, which is tiny on the plains. 160 acres from reservation land, and they could assimilate, aka become white farmers. Well, this was doomed to failure. They had never farmed, they had never done this kind of business. They're going to give them a little piece of land and nothing else, so they don't have any of the implements or a mule to plow the land or anything. You're going to become a farmer. And in the dry plains, 160 acres with no rain. And so this was doomed from the failure, doomed from the beginning. But this was done by people in the East who are thinking, what do we do with this problem here? What do we do? Well, we'll make them white farmers. Which, of course, they're not white either. And so you have this, remember, this is the most racist time in history. Well, what happened is, most of the land is not going to be claimed because most of the people on the reservation said, I can't farm. I don't want to give up the only thing I have, which is my tribal relationship. And those who did take it would go out of business within 30 years. So by 1910, 1920, it didn't work. And so all this land became open inside reservations that were supposed to go to American Indians. And so the thought was, well, we can't let that land go to waste. So what did they do? They gave it to other homesteaders or businesses, and therefore this will be called literally the White Land Rush. The most famous is when they opened up almost all of Indian Territory, which is what state today? They opened it up to homesteaders. In fact, there were a number of different times, they did this a number of times in 1900, where basically they had a bunch of homesteaders and they had little flags. And the thought was they would ride into this area that's now open to them, and they take a little flag to claim their land. And you want to get the best land near a river bottom, that kind of thing. And it would be at sunup, they'd fire a gun and they'd all take off. And the whole thought was, you better get your land sooner than later. And that's why Oklahoma is the sooner state. Because that's to get the land before anybody else gets it and take it from the people who have it. But what is the net result of this? And you can also imagine Indian agents, once they realized this was happening, they started setting aside the best land and not giving it to tribal members, and give it to whom? Friends for a kickback. And that is why today you have all these reservations across the West, and 50% of the land on reservations today are owned by people who aren't part of the reservation, including some of the best land. And the ones that always get me, because I've been there so many times, well, the two ones. First off, the Flathead Reservation, it's nearly 70% of the land are owned by people who are not tribal members. And like the Cheyenne Reservation, there are all these incredible cattle ranches there. None of them are Cheyenne. None of them. So what's going to happen on the reservation? By the way, here's the sale then of that land that was scooped up for people who didn't make it. They even put a picture of an American Indian, yeah.
So today are are Native Americans considered citizens?
Yes, they would get their citizenship, yes.
And so they're not considered like not another entity in the U.S.
It's still considered it's still considered to be a dependent nation within the United States. That's why the reservations, inside the reservations, state laws don't all necessarily apply there. But like I said, not necessarily. It's really complex. Some do, some don't.
A couple of them have really
And so with that is why there's so much poverty on reservations. If you take away all the best land and take away all the opportunities, what's going to happen on the reservations? So the poverty rates on reservations are sky high, and this is why. Now, it probably wasn't the plan, but it was a terrible policy because that's the result, especially when people realize, oh, I can make a lot of money. I can make a lot of money off this, and leads to misery. And one more thing, if poverty was so high and these farms didn't make it, what would that turn around and do? It would justify taking the land. See, they couldn't be farmers, so we'll take the land. Doesn't this remind you of the first one? The same thing happened for King Philip's War. It's a big deal. There are reasons why this happened. And the thought was, when this was not going well, it was clear in 1 year, ooh, this isn't working. Well, what's the problem? The adults can't do anything with them. They're doomed. I think I have one more thing I have to put down. The first effort to redress this, but since it's private property and the United States Constitution defends private property, the Indian New Deal, it was called, I know it's such an awkward name, but that's what it was called in 1934, would attempt to do some reform of this on land, and they could get back their tribal membership, but the land was gone. So if the adults they're a lost cause, let's get the kids. And that's going to lead to what's called the Burke Act. And that would set up schools. And the thought was they would Americanize the Indians, which is sort of amusing because they are, by definition, Americans. But we'll Americanize them. And this would be a forced assimilation, and it was doomed. They literally, by force, would take kids out of reservations and put in these schools. And some schools would attempt to be good, but most of them were incredibly brutal. And here's some of the propaganda from the school. Tom Torlino, he was a Navajo, and some of his pictures were some of the most famous, showing him as, and they literally would put down, the savage, now civilized. And these were ripped from their parents, and they went to go completely get rid of your tribal heritage. So you can't dress that way, can't wear your hair that way, like your old tribe. So I know a lot of people are Cheyenne, so I, probably about that, like a school called St. Lebre, which is now still a school, but not like this anymore. It's just a regular school. But they would go there, and so if anybody spoke Cheyenne, they beat them. And if you were beating your hair, beating, it would be a rod to the back of the thigh. You can never get hit hard in the back of the thigh. You know how bad that hurts. But there'd be other beatings too, but ripped apart from the family and not really allowed to go home. And the thought was, we will civilize them. In fact, one of the sayings was, and I am not making this up, to beat the Indian out of them. And these were unbelievable. And they would also become kind of informal orphanages. Even though their families were alive, the thought was, well, we got to get these children in white families. So they would be forcibly adopted into white families. And this is actually a big deal in a lot of ways. Obviously a big deal for the family and friends, but during the reform, efforts of reform, that little kind of brief little window of reform in the 1970s, they banned them. And that is why today, members of tribes, if they're going to be adopted, if they're adopted, they can only really be adopted by other tribal members because of the horrors of this. And which I know people who have tried. And I understand they're good, and they would be great parents, but I also understand this. You know what I mean? And so with that, the Carlisle School is the most famous. And General R. Pratt, right here, was the head of it. And this is one of his famous statements, right here. We'll kill the Indian to save him. Ironically, out of Carlisle School would be maybe the greatest athlete in American history would come out. Jim Thorpe. It's hard to find anybody who was a greater athlete than Jim Thorpe. The guy could literally do anything. And he came out of Carlisle School. Olympic gold medalist, he played professional baseball, professional football. There was no real professional basketball. I have good news for all of you. So this is where I ended. I will not test you on things we did not cover in class. Unless you really want to, you want to show off. Who would like to show off? Raise your hand. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to post on Teams. You ever notice that I'm going to post on Teams? And I might give you one other different category to make it easier for the one that didn't quite get you. Sound good? I'll give you that break. All right. At lunch, I will meet. This always takes longer to talk about the Dawes Act. I have to go into the details of things.
Thank you.
For the overarching categories, to like fit the individual IDs into there.
Yeah.
Is it like obviously some of them are obviously with some of the overarching topics, but like if one is kind of in between,
Put it in one.
it's okay. As long as it's okay.
Perfect. Okay. And I knew it was going to be that way, so I want just only don't use the same word twice. I know I do things, but you know what I mean. But yeah, I understand this. There's a lot with the sexualism and the Civil War.
Right. Yeah.
But you could argue the election of 1860 Yeah, you're right. And I try to make it as broad as possible so you have plenty of choices. Well done. You were back yesterday. Huh? What? You okay? How'd you do that? Line on a foot? You okay?
Yeah, I'm fine. I just kind of sore.
So now me.
Last year,
Look at this.
it was hard, and
There we go, guys. You got it.
Michael Jackson. And like that was it. And he was just like this. He said that like half the stuff I did was like better than his AP
always reminding me of new stuff that I had seen in the past and everything, and it's like, I'm trying my best here. But the thing that made me so mad is he didn't say anything until the very, very last assignment of the year. It was actually the final project. And I didn't even use it.
I did that one.
He never could have it. I didn't get a grade. There was just no grade. Like it just didn't show up in the hours. Yeah, so like last year, like the giant cat, and it was like this year. I was like, thank you, Isabel, for giving me good notes. How does the calendar really was doing something there? You know, the lessons we have this year have been like so short, and like I feel like really understand like additional and stuff like that. Yeah, and it's like depending on how this year goes, I'm not confident in like my skills to be in an AP, especially if I'm really sure it's clearly one of the teachers. So I don't know how this year goes. Like if by the end of the year I feel more confident and I want to continue, I think I will. But if not, I'm gonna come in and
Ooh, yeah, you are sold. Yes. Oh, you guys got fast.
yeah, doing it online.
Yeah, you got a haircut.
I got them all
haircut
fine.
last week too.
Like not bring
You got a haircut.
very last assignment. Like if it was that big of a deal, why didn't you talk to me?
Me?
Yeah.
Within
How
a lot of
often do you do it?
How would I do that for like the big I'm trying my best to if I think of these stuff
Yeah.
that I myself and stuff.
What we talk about class, the big thing was, the Jim Crow laws, the segregation, and the fight for equal rights. Yeah, exactly. And also, you'll be taught that. So people came to believe that was the truth.
So basically everything that I've been succeeding cool.
And maybe arguably today.
Yeah, like now, like I still kind of like
I'm listening, I just have run good. I gotta shut off the film. We filmed all of you coming in.
Oh my gosh.
I will be at lunch.